ushering his men back out of the door again. The door closed again on its strong battered hinges. When it was shut, Virginia brought up a sizable amount of phlegm from deep within her massive lungs, and she sent a great oyster flying towards the door. Sundown didn't see where it landed. She turned and cleared her throat hatefully. "Cheap piece of manure," she complained. "You ought to see what he likes me to do to him." She smiled at Sundown and giggled girlishly, despite her spitting prowess. Sundown pushed her to one side and tried to get up. She pinned him back down on the bed and laughed deeply. "Not so fast, Puddin'," she growled, reaching down to find him. "You owe the lady a drink, precious. Pay up." She fumbled for some minutes, confused. What was this? Sundown's eyes burned deep within her face as she cleared her throat again in surprise. "Boy," she whispered, "I turned it off that bad, did I? I'm sorry, Sundown. Please, I want you worse than any man I ever had. I ain't never made it with an outlaw as important as you are. Don't I do it for you, baby?" Sundown didn't move, and then a look of knowledge came across her face. "Oh, Sundown," she gasped, "I didn't know. You know, a lot of the boys I get up here are like that. Ain't it awful, honey?" She sat up like he was burning her. Sundown was one of them. Oh, if this ever got out. She stared down at him again. He was so precious lying there, his long hair all in disarray around her silken pillows. His sweet little face. He was so beautiful. She had the urge to just nurse him to sleep beside her. No, she decided, no one would ever know that the Sundown Bandit didn't like real women. She got up from him and wrapped herself in a robe. Then she dropped to her knees to retrieve his money bag from under the bed. None of it had spilled out. "Here," she handed him the bag, winking at him. "You behave yourself now with them cowpokes out there. You hear me, Sundown? And I thought that I was the sinner. There's hope for me yet." She winked at him again, and giggled her gravelly giggle. Sundown never said a word. He opened the bag and reached into it, withdrawing $600. He handed her the money. In shock she accepted it, and found she could not speak. In her hand was enough money to buy herself out of whoredom. In her hand was enough money to buy the whole town out of whoredom. "Sundown, I don't know what to say." He reached up and touched her lips gently, shushing her. He winked and pulled the mask up over his face again. Then he slipped over to the door to peek out the small curtained and shaded glass. It was now quite dark outside. He nodded to her as she was lighting a lamp over by the wall, blowing out the match. The door opened noiselessly. "It was nice meeting you, Sundown," she said, stammering excitedly. "I hope if you ever come—" She stared at the empty doorway. He was gone. "Back," she finished. She sniffed and held the pungent-smelling money up to her lips. She laughed and wondered why she was crying. "Oh, bugger me," she said at last. "You pay me a fortune, Sundown, and you could 'a' had me for free, and you didn't even want me." She dressed again and then walked downstairs to buy herself a drink. She needed it bad. She might just decide to take that midnight stage out of here tonight when it rumbled through. She might just decide to buy herself into respectable society back east. now that she could. She didn't know just yet what all she might do. 6 months later. Chatty Jean Dawson shifted in her seat and stared out the window sleepily. It had been a long ride for her, and a long time since she had been home to see her parents. It would actually be good to see Bad Rock Canyon for a few days, though she never thought she would hear herself say that. The cities back east did take their toll after a while. She had gotten tired of the faster pace of life, after all. Chatty Dawson was on break from finishing school, and she was going home for a few days. She closed her eyes as the train slowed even more. Soon it would stop altogether and take on water near the great water tower out here in the middle of nowhere. She hated stopping completely like this, so far away from a station. She knew that they were reasonably safe from the threat of Indians these days, but the barren prairie looked so bleak from these windows. Anything at all might decide to come wandering across that vast nothingness while they sat here helplessly taking on water for steam. She dreaded this particular stop worst of all. The train pulled up alongside the tower, which was mercifully on Chatty's side of the train. It served to break the scenery a little, seeing the great wooden tower and the struts and supports. It was like there was something out here with them, and they weren't alone. Almost like being at a station, rather than still 20 miles from Bad Rock Canyon and its very tiny but very populated train station. She could see the great wooden trough and the huge spigot that would somehow put water into the train's boiler tank. She didn't know how it worked, nor did she care. All she wanted was to get moving again as soon as possible. She knew it worked on gravity, but that was all. That was all she cared to know. Just fill the thing, please, and go. Her young friend, Bandy Maynard, had some time ago informed her and her mother that she was going to be attending a finishing school back east. Of all things. "I'm going to learn to be a lady, Chatty," Bandy had told her. "Aren't you jealous?" She had been, and so had Chatty's mother. Now Chatty's parents were wealthier than Bandy Maynard's. They were not about to stand by and let Chatty be bested by her friend. No, that would never do. Chatty's mother, a firebrand all the way around, had immediately enrolled her Chatty in Mary Marlston's school for young girls. Bandy was just going to St. Reginald's. There was a huge difference in the schools, about the same difference one would find in comparing Chicago to Bad Rock Canyon. Bandy had been livid, but she had hid it well. She was just glad to actually know someone going to Mary Marlston's nice academy. She drowned her jealousy in the sorrow at having to say goodbye to her friend Chatty Dawson. Their goodbyes had taken 3 weeks to complete. Maybe Bandy would be home this week as well. Many of the schools let out this time of year, though there was no holiday just now. Chatty was just glad to be able to slouch and do unladylike things without receiving those blasted demerits. They were about as hard on her as Aunt Grable had been. She smiled and was so glad she could ride the train alone, without Aunt Grable. Oh, not that she hadn't volunteered. "There is no way I am putting up with her on that train again, Mother. I swear I would rather have the Sundown Bandit carry me off and have his way with me." "You'll eat those words, Chatty Dawson, and with a bitter fare. Mark me," her mother had warned her, with a slight smile. Anyway, Chatty did get to ride the train alone at last. She opened her eyes now and saw only a horse tied to the water tower. Nothing else. Just an old ugly horse tied up out here. Now, what poor soul had wandered out here on horseback? She wondered, and then sighed audibly, aware that that would have gotten her a demerit in school. Demerit this and demerit that. What a crock of fish heads. She did it again, and enjoyed how good it felt to do that. Chatty loved to groan and stretch herself in her seat after a while of sitting. It made her feel good. She had enjoyed school, and would have enjoyed it more had it not been a finishing school. Still, she had made friends, and in particular one young lady named Raven Sarles from New Hampshire, or Vermont. She wasn't sure, but she did know that Raven Sarles was quite a character. She sneaked them cigarettes and wine. She knew how to meet and have relations with boys. Real boys. Her mother back in Bad Rock Canyon would have had an aneurysm over that. Raven Sarles had even done it before. Chatty felt guilty now. She had sneaked into Raven's room and had read her personal letters to one Asha von Arb, her little friend back home. That had been something. Chatty wondered who Asha was and what she looked like. Chatty wondered how Bandy was now doing at St. Reginald's. Chatty cleared her mind again before remembering something. There was something about that old ugly horse out there that bothered her, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Oh well, she let her mind drift back again. She had not thought of the Sundown Bandit since getting off the train in Philadelphia. She had worried that they might see him again on the way out there, and she had alternately been fantasizing him taking her, and yet fearing the very sight of him at the same time. Once in the school, however, and meeting people like Raven and Angelique, she had forgotten all about her favorite fantasy man, roaming the wild, wild west, as Raven liked to call her home. A further thought from Chatty's mind she had not had until just now. The Sundown Bandit. And that was when she looked at the horse again. That horse looked strangely like his horse, except there wasn't much white on it. She swallowed and thought to herself, "Oh no, that's his horse. There were 3 cars on this train, and there was the engine. She could not go through another robbery. This time she would have to drop her tiny purse into his bag and feel the rape personally. This time it would be her, not Aunt Grable. But she couldn't do it. She just knew she would scream right in his face, and he would shoot her. She got up and started slowly to the back of the carriage. After what seemed an age, she finally reached the door and opened it quickly. She stepped through and onto the back stoop, being the very last car on the train. staring back at the miles of track behind the train. Nothingness enveloped her like a great sadness, but she didn't stop to wonder about it. The door behind her closed just as the front door to her coach exploded inward with a bang. She had just missed the coming of the Sundown bandit. He was now in her coach, and by the sounds of the screams she heard coming through the wall, he was up to his old tricks again. Well, Chatty had seen that particular show, and she didn't want to sit through it again, thank you very much. She let out a whimper and ran nervously off the back of the platform, half falling onto the gravels below the train's metal staircase. She stumbled, but caught herself just as she was about to fall face down in the cinders. She ran down the slope towards the only bit of cover for miles, the water tower. The water tower was about 10 yards away from the train, and as she made for it towards that old ugly horse, she realized that the supports that held the water reserve up were not sufficiently thick enough for her to hide behind. Sundown would surely see her as he exited the train. Then he would shoot at her. Without thinking, she suddenly decided to scale the water tower, going up the set of ladder steps and reaching the balcony platform above the ground in seconds. She had just time to get on the platform and behind the great water tank above the horse before the back door of the train exploded open. She peered out from behind the tower now to see Sundown as he leaped off the train, catching himself neatly on strong legs, and running fast for the horse just below where she was now standing. Flattening herself against the tower, she prayed he would not see her. "Just get on your horse and ride away. Just ride off and allow me to climb back down and get back on my train. Just stay away from me," she prayed. She repented of all her wicked little fantasies now concerning him, and she bit her lip in a fearful shame. She didn't want him to have her after all. Her fires in her belly were all lies. "I take it back," she prayed silently. "I'll never do it again." Her thoughts screamed in her mind. "I take it all back. I don't want him." He ran under the tower and stood right below her. The horse rumbled out a disapproving neigh as he grabbed the mane of the great beast and breathed hard into it. Chatty could hear his breathing from way up here, 8 feet above him. She closed her eyes and winced hard. She had to keep her wits about her. She had to stop from screaming out in fright. She must not make any noise up here at all. At first, Chatty thought the whizzings beneath her were some strange sort of insect. The wing-plings of the bullets sounded like insect wings vibrating. Then her mind registered and could hear the loud, high reports of the shots coming from the train. They were shooting at her. Chatty winced her tears, terribly sorry now that she had left the train. She still had her purse in her hand, and now she felt like humming it down upon Sundown's head, screaming to him to just have it and be done with it. She only had $20. That certainly was not worth being shot over. But Sundown was not shooting back at the train at all. He might have gone away if they still weren't shooting at him. A shot went high and paranged off the tower behind her shoulder. The vibration of that shot chilled her as it raced through her body. She peered down at Sundown, who was waiting patiently for them to quit shooting at him. He certainly could not effect an escape without making himself a target. They were such bad shots that he didn't really fear taking a slug. The rounds were more likely to bounce up here and kill poor little Chatty where she stood. The train continued to fire random shots at the tower, but nothing hit anything important. Chatty soon began to grow impatient with them. She felt like yelling at them to stop shooting, so he would ride off and leave them be, so she could climb down and get back on her train. It was at that moment that her little heart stopped for an instant. She pretended that she did not hear what she heard. The hissing sound, the sound of the train pulling forward without one of its passengers, without Miss Chatty Dawson of Bad Rock Canyon. She peered around at the train and saw that it was indeed moving forward again. She looked down at Sundown, who was patiently waiting for the train to get out of rifle range before he moved again. From up here he seemed so calm and relaxed. "It's all your fault," she sniffed down at him. "It's all your fault," she sniffed silently. "I missed my train ride home." The train whistle blew goodbye to the water tower, Chatty Dawson, and the Sundown Bandit. She fought her tears back now. Anger invaded her fear now, and told her that she must not be left out here alone. Wolves and things lived out here at night. She would freeze to death in the prairie dew that fell and chilled the ground. No trees to hide her from the elements. Nothing at all. Just the snakes of the prairie and snakes. That ripped it. She was not about to stay out here with any snakes. It would probably be 3 days before a train came through here again, and then there was no guarantee it would stop for water. She had only one chance as she looked down to the horse below her. She realized that she had to act right now. She climbed onto the rail of the water tower and balanced herself precariously on the edge. Her boots stuck out over the 8-foot drop. She was awkwardly perched as though she was about to jump off the tower. Her skirts blew in the breeze above Sundown's head. She blew her breath out of her cheeks and blinked rapidly, staring straight down. "Get ready," she told herself, "and just don't think about it. It's your only shot at getting out of here. Do it. Now." The horse below her neighed and stepped back under her waiting toes. She couldn't do it. She whimpered in her throat. She had to do this, even if it meant breaking her leg. She closed her eyes and tried to let go. She couldn't. Her weight was jutting over the empty drop of space below her, but she could not fall. Her self-preservation instinct would not allow it. A sense of balance within her stopped her from leaving the platform. She could not do it. She slowly shoved herself forwards now, feeling the pull of gravity on her face as she leaned out over the horse and rider. "Fall," she commanded herself, eyes closing again. "Fall, fall, fall, fall." Just then the horse backed into the tower. A lurch from below her caused her to twist her weight to compensate, and she twisted out over the open space. The center of her weight shifted far enough out over the horse and rider, and she let go to catch her balance. That was her mistake. Her eyes flew open as she fell off the tower. Chatty Dawson felt the rush of wind and gravity. The horse grunted deeply as Chatty landed on the back of the Sundown Bandit. The strong legs of the horse lurched sideways and down a bit to accept the falling weight from above. Although Chatty only weighed about 90 pounds, soaking wet, The force of her fall magnified her weight to a respectable drop. Sundown folded under the blow. Chatty grabbed for his back, and she thought for an instant that she had succeeded in knocking Sundown off of his horse altogether. But Sundown had lightning reflexes and recovered admirably. Sundown had a death grip on the horse, and Chatty had a death grip on Sundown. The horse absorbed the greater part of the force of Chatty's fall, and instead of collapsing onto the ground, it stumbled out from behind the water tower, right in plain view of the slowly moving train. To Chatty's horror, the train was still within range to shoot at them. Now whizzing rounds passed by them on either side. Sundown kicked the horse in its ribs, and off they went, away from the train and tracks and water tower, across the open prairie, as fast as the horse could carry them. Chatty snuggled close and hung on for dear life. She closed her eyes as the high whizzing of rifle rounds zinged by them on either side. She closed her eyes and prayed. Only now did it occur to little Chatty Dawson that this was her wish. Like her mother had warned her, she was getting her little fantasy now for real. Had she been in her own bed, she could have moved her hand against herself and then gone straight to sleep. But in the real world, Sundown smelled like an old blanket, and his odor was very much like her own when she was really grungy with travel. This wasn't her dream at all. The landing on Sundown had hurt her ribs and her bottom. She prayed that she had not ruptured herself and lost her virginity. She would have nothing to wipe the blood with out here. Oh, God, she trembled. Where are we going? Her inner thighs were bruised, and her back ached with the pressure of the fall. She had used her thighs to clasp Sundown like a prostitute does her lover, and she felt shame in every pumping thrust of this horse's stride. She was beginning to ache now. She wished that he would stop for just a moment and let her off for just a moment. But he didn't. She was gripping her own wrists in front of the outlaw's chest, leaning against his back. She was in this position when she got the shock of her life, as she was repositioning her handhold. Her hand nudged the firmest, ripest breast she had ever felt. What's this? A woman's breast on the Sundown Bandit? She had not noticed that they were entering a wooded area. Chatty's shock at finding out this truth about Sundown was way too much to concentrate on where they were. Before she knew it, Sundown had stopped the horse and was sitting bolt upright, not saying a word, waiting for her to jump off and allow her to dismount as well. Chatty slid off the horse and stumbled to regain her balance on her weak legs. She stood up now weakly, staring at Sundown, who dismounted and turned to her. Sundown the Bandit was a woman. "Dear God," muttered Chatty, in disrespect for the figure in front of her. As Sundown took off the hat, all that hair came falling out from under the 10-gallon Stetson. She shook it back out of her eyes and regarded Chatty coolly. The first thing that Chatty noticed was Sundown did not blush and stammer with womanly shame at being discovered wearing a pair of men's pants and acting like a darn fool outlaw. Instead, Sundown stared hard at Chatty. Chatty felt like she was looking at a cave woman who could neither speak nor understand the concept of communication. Chatty swallowed hard. Sundown took a rope off her horse and bound Chatty's hands in front of her. The knot was as secure as if it had been carved out of a single piece of wood. Chatty was bound and led over to a tree. Chatty felt like giving up and crying, but she didn't. Not yet, anyway. Sundown tied her to the tree and then stood back to roll herself a smoke. She lit it with a match, striking it on the bottom of her boot. Chatty watched her in fascination. Sundown did not say a word during this time, and it was Chatty who broke the spell of silence between them. It was she who finally got Sundown to acknowledge that Chatty was a living thing, and not part of the saddle gear she had picked up along the way. "Why aren't you a man?" she asked, her tongue getting loose with fear. "Only men do this stuff. You're a woman." Sundown still did not speak. "Can't you say something?" asked Chatty. "Are you as stupid as you look?" Sundown got right up in Chatty's tiny face and breathed smoke and whiskey breath into Chatty's tender nostrils. Her eyes did not play. Chatty's attention was held hard. "Don't let your mouth overload your skirts, little lady," whispered Sundown, with a whisper like a snake over dry leaves. Chatty trembled, and Sundown smiled into her fear. "What do you want with me?" asked Chatty. Sundown moseyed over and stirred in the coals of a dying fire. Sparks crackled and snapped, and Sundown watched the fire blaze up once again after a few moments. The blaze was comforting and warm to Chatty, even from over here by the tree. Dark was coming soon, and the things of the night were coming with it. Sundown picked up the small purse from off the ground and rifled through it, taking out $20 and staring at it for a moment. Chatty had apparently dropped her purse on the ground when Sundown had tied her hands together. Sundown looked at the wad of bills in her fingers like a fisherman looking at a small catch. She grimaced and tossed the money back into the purse. Then she turned and flipped it at Chatty, striking her on the chest and hurting her feelings more than anything else. Sundown saw the furious blaze of her newly built fire, and satisfied with it, she turned once more to Chatty, regarding her like a prized trophy. "Tough little thing, aren't you?" asked Sundown, getting right up in Chatty's face. "Not every little girl who would jump on my back like that." She spat out a piece of loose tobacco from her soggy cigarette and winced a smile at her captive. "Untie me, please," said Chatty firmly. Sundown laughed and sat down beside her. She lay back against the tree beside Chatty's spindly legs, and she groaned like she was tired. She pushed her hat over her eyes and pretended to sleep. "Did you hear me?" asked Chatty impatiently. "Untie me right now." Sundown did not answer her. "I said for you to untie me," said Chatty, louder. Sundown giggled, which served to infuriate Chatty even more. "You stupid woman, did you hear me?" yelled Chatty loudly. "Get off your stinky, smelly behind and untie me right now." Sundown got up and stood before her. Their eyes met, and Chatty did not look away. Sundown's eyebrows went up as she regarded Chatty Dawson. Then she set her jaw and decided to test this little girl to see exactly what she was made of. She raised her hand to slap Chatty full across the mouth, but Chatty did not move, nor did she even flinch. Sundown brought her hand down on Chatty's incredibly soft cheek. incredibly softly. "Why didn't you slap me?" asked Chatty quietly, as Sundown touched her face. "I see that you aren't afraid of me," said Sundown. "You must have been hit before." "My mother," said Chatty. "That's her favorite way to get my attention." "You're used to it, huh?" "Yes," said Chatty, remembering back home and wishing for it just now. "Yeah, I'm used to it." Sundown seemed detached now and distant. "I can't trust you," she said. "Well, at least loosen this up so I can sit down," said Chatty, tears in her eyes anew. "You'd think that I was the criminal and not you." "In my world," said Sundown softly, "you are the criminal." She loosened Chatty's bonds, allowing her to sit down upon the ground. The ground was cool and soft under her bruised behind. She let out a soft gasp as the moss under the tree soothed her hot, injured bottom. "That better?" asked Sundown, retying her to the tree. "Yes," said Chatty. "Thanks." "You're entirely welcome," said Sundown, laughing and shaking her great matted head of hair. Chatty thought she had never seen a wilder-looking woman in her life. Chatty watched as Sundown started making coffee, placing a small set of sticks over the fire like one of those crude, makeshift spits. From this she dangled a coffee pot from the rough wire as a sort of dangling pot over the fire. Sundown then walked back into the woods, and from somewhere pulled a great side of salted beef off a tree limb where it had been hanging. 3 strips of this went into a great frying pan, and soon the smells of frying bacon could be smelled all around the forest. Chatty's little mouth watered. From a satchel in her tent, Sundown brought out some rough, stale-looking biscuits. These she placed in a metal plate, and precariously perched this plate over the fire on this weird-looking spit. The heat from the fire would soften these biscuits enough to eat them. Chatty wondered how many times these same biscuits had been revamped, and how many times they had hardened back over again. But she found she didn't really care. She was getting that hungry. The pot was beginning to boil beneath the plate of biscuits. She took that off the spit and placed it on the ground to cool. The biscuits remained high above the flame, and down below, right in the fire itself, was the frying pan sizzling away. Sundown got her plate and grabbed herself off a biscuit. She licked her fingers wet and then reached into the frying pan to retrieve a strip of bacon. She got her pewter mug out of her bag and poured herself some coffee. Then, to Chatty's surprise, she came over, sitting down on the ground, in a cross-legged Indian fashion. She smiled at Chatty and then spoke. "You may think that I am ill-mannered," she began, and rough. "You are right. I am. But I want you to know something before you condemn me, girl. I could have knocked your pretty little buns off that tower back there today with one shot. I could have lost you somewhere between that train and my campsite here with one well-placed elbow in your tiny stomach. I could have killed you on the way out here with less effort than it takes to spit right in your eye." Chatty swallowed and listened carefully. "But I knew you were going to try that jump. Sure enough, you did it. I had to finally bump the support with old Frater here," she said, nodding to the horse. "But you did land perfectly. Nice jump." "You knew all along?" asked Chatty, shocked. Sundown smiled. "I was in the coach before yours, and I saw you heading for the exit door. I thought to myself, where does she think she's going? When I came out of the back door, I saw you up on the tower, and I knew you had screwed up good. They were going to either shoot you or leave you." "You saw me?" asked Chatty, blushing hard. "Yeah, I did," she said. "I figured that if one of Pinkerton's fools didn't nail you with a stray round bouncing off of a warped board, then they would certainly pull away from the tower and leave you. I could have left you if I wanted to, but I knew that they were going to leave you pretty much high and dry, right there. Then I saw you climbing up onto the rail, like you were going to jump on me. I figured, whoa, look at this. I backed old Freighter right into that support, and you fell on top of me as neat as whiskey no ice." Sundown seemed pleased with the stunt. "I'm glad you enjoyed it," said Chatty, trying to sit up. "I am sore as a boil." "Ah, you'll live," said Sundown. "Once I fell through a mill roof. Rotting piece of crap, just fell right through it. I thought, there goes my sweet little butt. But my time wasn't up, you know." Chatty didn't know. "Hit a bag of flour," said Sundown. "Got covered in white like a ghost. Walked out without a scratch." Chatty. "How do you know my name?" asked Chatty. "It's Chatty Dawson. Am I right?" asked Sundown. "Right," said Chatty. "But how do you know?" "Says so in your purse," said Sundown. "A paper from your school. Letter, maybe. You are in a finishing school back east, it read. I didn't want your money, girl. I just wanted to know who you were without asking." "Do you always take just what you want?" asked Chatty. "Always," said Sundown. "I wanted you, and I took you off that tower. Simple." Sundown looked at her hard and continued, "Chatty, you are looking at me like I ain't got good sense, or maybe I'm not as smart as you are. You didn't think I could read either, did you? Well, growing up with 6 mean old outlaws, you get tough. You get real tough, baby." Sundown took a handful of food on a fork and said, "Open your trap, and I'll feed you. I'm the best cook there is. You just don't know it yet." Chatty looked at the plate Sundown had in front of her. The smell was divine. Chatty accepted the fare open-mouthed, which tasted as good as it smelled. A warm feeling of comfort began to settle over Chatty as she chewed, and the Sundown Bandit talked about her life. The sun went down without either of them noticing it. "My daddy was the head of the Silent Shadows. You ever hear of them?" Chatty nodded no, she hadn't. "Ma died when I was a baby," said Sundown. "Died giving me life. My daddy met up with Jake Daggert and his merry band of thugs." "Except for my daddy, all men are thugs. I'd sooner draw a knife on a man, Chatty Dawson, as look at him." "I learned what I can from reading old books. I find 'em everywhere out here, Chatty. You'd be surprised at the books I find out by the canyon areas. People done overloaded their Conestoga wagons when they comin' out west, and they had to leave most of that stuff by the road. Why, back up at Daddy's cabin, I got a regular library. You wouldn't believe it. A lot of the books got water stains on 'em and all, but they can be read as good as a new one can." Chatty chewed and enjoyed her meal. Sundown enjoyed telling this city girl how much alike they really were. "So you see, Chatty Dawson, I ain't exactly stupid. I ain't no lady, but I'm smarter than every man I ever met." Daddy's men treated me just like one of 'em, Chatty, and not a one of 'em would have thought of asking me for bedroom rights after I got to be 13. I was as much a man as they were." "Congratulations," thought Chatty, chewing her excellent meal. "I'm happy for you." Why any woman would not want to be a lady was beyond Chatty Dawson. "Now ain't that the best grub in all the Louisiana Purchase?" asked Sundown, wiping Chatty's mouth with a deftly gloved hand. Chatty nodded as Sundown gave her a sip of coffee to wash it down with. "I like you, Chatty," said Sundown. "If I didn't, I would have killed you for a fool thing like you did today." She explained Chatty's stupidity to her in her roughest language. "Do you have to cuss like that?" asked Chatty softly. "Yep," said Sundown, getting up and dusting off her buttocks. "Reckon I do. It's the way I've always talked, and it's been good enough for me all these years." "But if you didn't curse so much," said Chatty, "you would sound more learned." Sundown stared at Chatty wonderingly. "You really think so?" asked Sundown. "You really think I'd sound smarter if I didn't cuss so much?" "Guaranteed," smiled Chatty. Sundown was still looking at her. Then she went over and started cleaning up her mess. She hadn't eaten very much tonight, not nearly as much as Chatty had eaten. Chatty could understand how eating the same thing every day and night might cause one to be less than ravenous for it at the end of the day. She watched as Sundown went through her ritual and prepared her pallet to sleep upon. When she had gotten totally ready for bed, down to slipping her boots off and stretching her tired stocking feet out, she looked at Chatty and sighed. "I'm sorry I can't untie you, Sugarfoot," said Sundown. "But I might get up and find my horse gone. Then I'd have to kill you. I'd hate that. Wouldn't you?" Chatty nodded fearfully within her rope restraints. "Fine, then," said Sundown, throwing her a quilt. It landed perfectly covering the legs and thighs of Chatty Dawson, where she sat strapped to the great tree. "Good night, Miss Dawson. See you in the sunlight." With that, Sundown groaned against the pallet and closed her eyes to sleep. Chatty sat staring at her for a long time. As the fire slowly fizzled to embers in the cooling night. "Sundown?" asked Chatty, after a little while. "Does anyone else know you are the Sundown Bandit? I mean, does your daddy know?" Sundown waited a moment before she answered. Finally she said, "Just you, Sugarfoot. So if it gets out, I'll know where to come looking, won't I?" Chatty swallowed hard and sat back against the tree, closing her eyes. "John Williams," said Sheriff Bogus. "Come here a minute." The man walking down the dirt street turned to the lawman on the steps of the jail. He walked over to him as the sheriff tossed him a circular piece of copper-colored metal. As the man looked at it, he saw there was a 5-pointed star in an open circle. The words "Deputy Sheriff" appeared written around this circular border. "Deputy Williams, that is," said the sheriff. "Raise your right hand and spit in it, and tell me you love me." The man raised his right hand, spat into it, and said, "Till death do us part." The sheriff laughed and stepped off the porch to slap the newly deputized man upon his firm, broad back. There was a smile on his face. "Fair enough, then," said the sheriff. "What is it this time, Sheriff?" asked John, placing the badge upon his leather vest, where 5 previous holes already existed. This was not the first call to raise the hue and cry for John Williams. "Got one needs catching, Sheriff?" "Needs finding, John," said the sheriff, raising his great hunk of arm to point towards the train station. "You see that lady over there, the one giving the station master down in the mouth? Right over there." John looked to see the woman screaming at the man, and shuddered. "Blue Hades hath no fury like that," he said under his breath. "Exactly," said the sheriff. "John Williams, there stands one mad little beaver, and she's been chewing on Grady's privates for over an hour now. I'd a done slapped her silly and resigned my commission by this time, but Grady is a lot more of a man than I am, just for taking it." John stared at the 2 figures in the distance and said, "Hey, ain't that one John Dawson's wife? Jenny Lathrop, before her marriage?" Sheriff Bogus smiled and moaned that it was. "At one time I would a killed for a little bit of that." The sheriff seemed much wiser today by comparison, and John noted this with a wry grin. "Now the subject of our investigation is that little woman's offspring, a cute little filly known as Chatterley Jean Dawson. It would appear that she did not arrive this day with her luggage on the 4:10. It is imperative that we get that little booch back, alive and crying and in one piece. Understood? Anything less than this, John Williams, and we shall find ourselves, as they say in merry old England, without a situation." "Understood," said John. "Let me go kiss the wife and kids good-bye, and oil up my old bottle popper, and I'll be here within the hour." "No," said Sheriff. "Eat first. Then come with some of your wife's excellent corn pone. By cracky, if I gotta lay on the hard, rain-soaked prairie ground tonight, I aim on getting something out of it. You stay at home till she whips up some of her world-famous hardtack, then bring it with you. You follow?" "Yes, sir," laughed Williams, "I do. And maybe a mite of corn-squeezing syrup as well." The sheriff smiled as wide as the canyon beyond them. "I knew there was some reason I kept picking you for these little posse runs," he said, turning to go back to the jail. "Let me feed Schoonover in there, and leave him with Tommy Saunders, and I'll fetch us up some blood warm for later." "Schoonover?" asked Williams. "You mean that old drunk is locked up again?" "Yeah," said Bogus with a smile, "and I agreed, out of the very goodness of my heart, to watch his still for him, just so it don't blow. He's got a right decent run coming out this time, and I reckon there's an old jar or 2 out there to get us a little taste, just to see if it's any good, you understand. Got to police the local spirits as well." Williams nodded. He turned to leave and smiled. "Moonshine, huh? Well, at least they were gonna be warm." The rain that Sheriff Bogus had predicted came about 1 in the morning. By that time the 2 lawmen were well into their 2nd jar of the corn squeezins, and were eyeing a 3rd one tucked in the sheriff's saddle-bags. He had brought 5 with him altogether, but if they dared even look at the 4th one tonight, they'd be so stinking drunk that the morning sun would blister them blind. No, they'd save the rest for another night, and try to get some sleep. No use to travel in the rain and get sick as well. They found shelter under a rock overhang from one of the canyon walls, and they slept soundly, both of them full of booze. They did not know it, but they were exactly 15 miles from the sleeping form of Chatty Dawson. Chatty Dawson was dreaming. She was dreaming she was in boarding school. There was water falling in her face from somewhere. Water, she thought. Great. I've overslept, and Mrs. Browser is flicking a wet mop in my face. She mentally tried to recall how many times this month she'd been in bed after wake-up call. 3, 4. Dear Lord, if it was 4, she was going to get a trip to the whipping block in the courtyard. 4 lates in a month meant 4 smacks with a stick. Fear and terror gripped her little heart as she tried to surface from her intense sleep. No, please, she'd never been switched before at school. Never. Mama would somehow find it out and then belt her black and blue on the butt when she got her home. Please, no, not that. No, screamed Chatty, waking up fully. Don't whip me, I'm sorry. But nothing answered her in return. Chatty stared into the utter darkness with a fearful confusion. She tried to move her hands, but couldn't. What was wrong with her? Why couldn't she get up? Was she still asleep? It was pitch-black dark, but her eyes adjusted. Chatty began to understand things in a hurry. Number 1, she was outside. Number 2, she was being rained upon. Number 3, she was tied helplessly to a tree. It all came back in a flash. Chatty Dawson started to weep. Tears hot and thick poured down her face as she sobbed loudly. There was nothing else she could do. She could not raise her hands to wipe her face from the cold rain. She could not cover her head with the soaking wet quilt she had across her legs. She could do nothing, in fact, but lay there, sobbing to the winds. Chatty Dawson felt like she was just going to plain die. The Sundown Bandit was dreaming. In her dream she was naked, and she was an infant again. Her mother had her up to the breast. She was letting her drink, and Sundown was getting a nice stream of hot milk, which soothed every inch of her tiny pink body. The taste of her mother's milk eased her, and gave her a comfort sweeter than the hot flush of whiskey. She smiled in her sleep. She knew that her mother was being relieved of the tense soreness from the engorgement of milk, and she drank eagerly. Her mother smiled in pleasure. It felt good for both of them. "Sweet little thing," whispered her mother. "I am so blessed you have such an appetite." Her mother groaned, and Sundown knew, even as an infant, that the act was nice for Mom as well. Such a warm, soft act that Sundown bit her lips softly in her sleep, and drank, and drank, and drank. The drinking of her mother's milk, the smell of her mother's soft skin, all of it was wonderful. She could dream this dream forever. That was when the baby started crying. Sundown's eyes shot open, ruining her dream. She instantly went on alert. There was no baby out here. What was making all that racket? It was raining. So, big deal. She wouldn't even get up for that. Then it dawned on her. Chatty. It was raining on her. As Sundown stood up, she remembered Chatty Dawson. Why in the world had she allowed that girl to jump on her like that from the tower? Sundown really didn't know. She had seen the girl trapped up there and had liked her right away. Chatty was a beautiful child, dressed in her pretty floral green dress with her black boots and small ribbons in her ponytail. She was adorable. But now Sundown felt ashamed at having left her tied to the tree like that. Shame was a new feeling for Sundown. Everything in her wild life usually went off quite well. Tonight she realized that feeding Chatty and talking to her had made her forget to count her booty. Counting the take from a robbery was the most important part, and she had just left it saddled to the old horse. She was really slipping. Sundown walked over to the sobbing child tied to the tree. Now it seemed quite brutal to have tied her up like that. Floods of feeling washed through the Sundown bandit. Maternal feelings, strange, erotic, and motherly feelings of warmth and need. God, what was this? What was happening to her? Sundown felt lightheaded, like she had been smoking hemp. Sundown untied Chatty quickly. Her poor little dress was drenched. Sundown heard the girl as she sneezed in her arms. She placed Chatty over on her pallet. There were about 7 great quilts in Sundown's saddle roll, but most of them had been used to wrap her gear with. 3 of them, however, she took over to wrap Chatty's tiny shivering form. Sundown wriggled under the quilts now beside the girl and wrapped her arms around the child's body. The girl felt and smelled very good. It felt very good hugging up beside Chatty Dawson. It felt as good as her mother in the dream. Neither of them moved until morning. When Chatty finally got her eyes open, she felt like the train had run over her. Aching and stiff from the damp ground and the wild ride on horseback yesterday, the first thing she had to do was pee. Her little bladder was so full that she felt like she might explode. She managed to get to her feet and shoot by Sundown, who was making them breakfast. She disappeared into the trees to squat. Holding a tree limb for support, she sighed aloud with furious relief. Oh, that felt good. She stepped sheepishly out moments later. It was so unladylike to need anything that badly, even in front of this uncouth woman bandit. She did feel shame. Sundown, however, did not even look up at her. Chatty blinked and saw that it was almost afternoon. She had slept all day long. Her clothes, however, were now completely dry on her body. "You making breakfast?" said Chatty, trying to be friendly. "That's sweet of you." Sundown didn't say anything. Chatty watched for any signs of familiarity in those cold blue eyes of the bandit, but she saw none at all. "Your breakfast is ready," whispered Sundown, as calmly as that, when she finally did stand up. Chatty ate and drank her coffee from a pewter mug. The breakfast was terribly good, despite the fact that it tasted very much like last night's supper. Chatty watched the bandit now as she moved about, straightening up things and putting them in their proper place. It seemed to Chatty that the bandit was packing to leave this area now for good. Sundown killed the fire and kicked dirt over the smoking embers. Chatty ate and watched her in silence. Sundown got her horse packed, and Chatty wondered if Freighter could haul them both. As Sundown tied the great bundle on the horse's back, Chatty realized that there would be little way they could outrun a posse looking for her. They would have to travel by way of these woods here, and that, of course, meant Chatty would not be home tonight. Sundown turned back to Chatty and saw Chatty cleaning out her little dish on a swatch of prairie grass, just as she had seen Sundown do last night. Sundown waited until she had finished, and then she took the packed bag Chatty handed her, dish and mug inside, and she placed it into the saddlebag on the horse. The horse today was even bigger than Chatty had recalled it being from yesterday. It did not seem to be bothered at all by the weight Sundown was loading onto its back. "Okay," said Sundown, when everything was at last ready to go. "It's been long enough for them to start a posse coming out of Bad Rock, and I ain't aiming on them finding us here. You know they'll say I kidnapped you, and so forth." She stopped and considered Chatty, to see if she had anything to say about that. She didn't, and Sundown continued. "Now when I drop you off, I might give you about 5 miles or so to walk it on your own. This will give me time to leave. You understand that, don't you? If you don't, you ought to." Sundown turned and held Freighter's head still. She looked back at Chatty and said, "Okay, get on if you can. If not, you're on your own. I'm leaving here." They mounted the horse and disappeared into the woods together. At 5 o'clock the next afternoon, the two-man posse of Sheriff Bogus would arrive to survey the remains of Sundown's campsite. A full 27 hours later. As the sheriff and his faithful deputy arrived at the campsite, they each dismounted and carefully looked around the ashes of the fire. The sheriff was not usually a very serious man, but today he was deathly serious. He scattered the ashes with his boots and picked through the weeds surrounding the campsite. Finally he stopped and looked up. "Well," said Sheriff Bogus, "I reckon that Sundown and the girl went off that way." He pointed into the woods. "How do you know he's got her?" asked Williams, confused and scratching his head. "Well," said the sheriff, "it's like this, son. People leave trash and things in the course of camping that tells me who they were." "But he has left us nothing," said Williams, looking helplessly through the bush area surrounding what was obviously the campsite. "How do you even know this is his camp?" Sheriff Bogus smiled. "He picked up the place too well," said Sheriff Bogus. "Anybody camping out here would have left a little something to let us know who they were, don't you think?" "How do you know he's got the girl with him?" asked Williams, "even if this is his campsite?" "You missed this, son," said the sheriff, handing him a piece of paper.